The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "If your brother does something wrong, go and have it out with him alone between your two selves. If he listens to you, you have won back your brother. If he does not listen, take one or two others along with you. The evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses is required to sustain any charge. But if he refuses to listen to these, report it to the community. And if he refuses to listen to the community, treat him like a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you solemnly, whatever you bind on earth shall be considered bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be considered loosed in heaven. I tell you solemnly once again, if 2 of you on earth agree to ask anything at all, it will be granted to you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 meet in my name, I shall be there with them." And this is the gospel of the Lord. So what do you do? What do I do when someone offends us, hurts us? Jesus is instructing his followers, if your brother does something wrong, go and have it out with him alone between your two selves. He's giving instructions to his followers as to how to deal with disputes or hurts that are caused. And he's giving the early Christians who would have been receiving this advice and wanting to follow Jesus were smallish communities, usually about 20, 30 people who would gather together, who would kind of share their lives more than would be kind of common for us now. They'd share a large part of their lives together, and they'd share the celebration of the Eucharist together. They'd know one another and know one another very well because they'd be a small group of Christians generally among a big population. So they'd have a deep kind of level of interaction, deep level of sharing. So these are some of Jesus' instructions to his followers, how to deal with differences and disputes and so on. So the question, what do you do? What do I do when someone hurts or offends us? Well, one of the things, and it's contained in these instructions, is that we express it. And that's important. It's important to express hurt and to express anger. To express hurt and anger to people who would understand, to a friend, friends, to people who know to some degree what we're talking about. That's a helpful thing to do, and I think a very necessary thing to do. Because anger, buried, creates problems and difficulties. It's a bad recipe to follow, to try to pretend that something hasn't happened or pretend we're not angry, or to let our anger seep out in quiet, awful ways. That's not good. Anger suppressed can be very, very damaging. We hear in the whole talk about mental health and the consciousness about mental health illness these times, which is good and great that there is that consciousness. We hear people say over and over again how it's good to talk, or how they got great relief and help in talking about the particular problem. And that's great and that's good. I don't think that kind of advice, that it's good to talk, just applies to mental health illness. It applies to an awful lot of things. It is literally good to talk, we need to talk, and we need to talk to one another. And I think particularly in areas like this, where there's anger or hurt, we need to talk to one another. So to express it, at least to people who will know to some degree what we're talking about, to express it to the person themselves that has offended us. Although that's tricky territory. If we're really kind of steamed up with anger and we go after someone, not good. Usually provokes more and more anger and eventually gets us kind of nowhere. Some sort of cooling period, some kind of us to be somewhat at peace before we try to talk directly to the person who causes that grief or that difficulty. Recently, I was talking to a man, or more particularly, he was talking to me, and he was very articulate and very definite and described the scene very well. He talked about it, a hurt that his family had suffered from a member of the family. And he talked about how they were intent on expressing this, on doing something about it. And he was angry, and he was very angry. And I was humbly trying to suggest maybe some kind of cooling period, and then maybe, I don't know if he was listening to that though. He was intent on going ahead and expressing this anger and doing something about it in that sense. And he was very intent, and he was very angry, and understandably. But it can be a difficult thing, because anger can beget anger. Much better if we can. Here's an even more difficult thing. Much better if we can to cool down and then fairly earnestly and directly and honestly talk to that person. So, one definite thing, we should talk about it. The other thing I think we should do is we should talk to God about the hurts. I mean, I think this is an area of life that applies to all of us. Part of living is that we, in ways, hurt other people hurt us. So I would presume, and I hope and I believe correctly, that this would apply in some measure to all of us. Hurts are given, hurts happen. So two things really that I want to say about this morning. First, that we should talk about it. Talk to friends, people we know will to some degree understand what we're talking about. That's a necessary thing to do. The other thing that's good, I think, is that we talk to God about how we're hurting. That we gain some measure of peace and His healing power into our lives. I know of two men who are kind of friendly. And one of them started saying naughty, bad things, nasty things about his friend. And that went on for some time. Sometime later, I met the one about whom some nasty things had been said. And he spoke very positively, very, very positively about the other man. And I said to him, how is it you can be so positive about our friend, knowing, as he did, knowing that he's been saying nasty things about you? And he said to me, I don't bear grudges. I don't bear grudges. Now, I'm sure that wasn't kind of a grace or a gift that he had come to all of a sudden. I think he'd been sort of working at that attitude of not bearing grudges for a long time. And he'd been working at that kind of attitude with the help of God. And it struck me that he had a gift. The gift we see in people, I mean, one of the things when I think of this area of life, I think to myself how small we can be, how small we are. And the things that kind of annoy you or me, maybe, can be very, very small. Things that can split up families or have ones not talking to one another. When you look at it, it can be remarkably small things that can fester and grow and develop. And when you think then of the kind of large issues that some people, the likes of Gordon Wilson and then of Skillen many years ago and his daughter Mary, and he could forgive. Nelson Mandela had to forgive a great deal, and he could do so with grace. And yet we can be bogged down. We can function with a degree of anger and kind of bitterness in our hearts, maybe for years, over something very slight. So, the first question, or the question I began with, what do you do, or what do I do when I'm hurt or offended? One of the things I should do, I think, is I should talk about it, communicate in some way the hurt. The other thing that we should do, I think, is that we should talk to God about it. I mean, when we think of hurts and burdens that we carry in that line of maybe a bitterness or an anger at someone, what about the last instruction of that gospel? For where 2 or 3 meet in my name, I am there with them. And if you agree to ask anything at all, it will be granted to you. What about us this morning? Ask that we may be granted the healing grace of God's power to deal with life's hurts, to deal with the hurts we've received maybe, to deal with the hurts that will come our way. And Jesus says to us, if you ask anything at all, we're 2 or 3, we're more than 2 or 3 this morning. If you ask anything at all, it will be granted to you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 meet in my name, I shall be there with them. Hurt, anger, feeling of the burden or the unhappiness of what's been said to us or done to us, if we bring it to God and let His healing grace touch our lives, then, if we ask Him anything at all, He says, it will be granted to you. Ask Him for grace and peace and healing.